So we're going to move into our next discussion, which is study design. And Steve Hauser is going to present, is going to introduce our thinking on this. And again, we'll open it up for broader discussion of the commission and our participants in the public.
Thank you, Amy. Our subgroup has had numerous very animated discussions that are still evolving. And John has ably led much of our thinking in the subgroup, and Alex Garza is not here today, but has also been quite active. So our discussions have centered around study design. And we have focused on two general areas. The first is the science of study design, rigorous science as an ethical requirement. And the second, reviewing the tensions and possible ways forward between achieving scientific rigor, useful clinical information in some cases, while protecting patients. So to begin with the science behind study design considerations, it is clear that if the science is weak, the ethics cannot be strong. These issues are particularly challenging in the new era of global trials. In addition to the myriad of ethical issues, there are scientific issues that are raised in new ways by global trials. Genetic differences, disease differences, underlying heterogeneity, interaction effects because of environmental conditions, other drugs being used in some parts of the world and not others, etc., all leading to stratification of responses. And it's very important that trials that are global take into account the stratification issues in different parts of the world so that we can understand if a study with one population is applicable for the other. The second issue that we spent actually most of our time on relates to what is probably the most contentious issue in this arena, the choice of comparison groups in trials. And our fundamental question was how to decide a path forward for comparison, for determinations about comparator groups that are ethically acceptable. And we, as others in the recent past, have moved towards a common ground for comparator groups. And the comparator group may either be placebo or, in some cases, a choice of an active treatment that may arguably not represent the most effective treatment available. We would propose that when the requirements of rigorous study design potentially conflict with the legitimate rights and interests of research subjects, that we embark upon this middle path that would protect subjects in this comparator group, but only if certain conditions are met. And we would propose 6. First, when the most effective treatment globally is not known to be the most effective treatment locally for a particular population because of genetics, the customary health behaviors, level of infrastructure, or other considerations. Second, when the choice of a particular comparator is required to advance a study that is responsive to the local host community. Third, if potential harm or inconvenience to subjects is insignificant or extremely unlikely. Fourth, there are weighty methodologic issues behind the choice of that particular study design. Fifth, subjects in the comparator group are not subjected to substantially increased risk of mortality or serious morbidity. And finally, whatever comparator arm is selected, IRBs need to carefully review and approve the scientific rationale and ethical justification for the study design. And IRBs should ensure that subjects at risk of harm from non-response are excluded, that the placebo or less effective comparator group is of limited duration, that subjects are carefully monitored, that rescue measures are in place should symptoms develop, and that withdrawal criteria for subjects with adverse events are implemented.
Thanks. Just for people who weren't at our last session, I think it's important to remind everybody that we had a session in which we invited Ruth Macklin and Bob Temple to give us, who engaged in an ongoing debate about when placebo-controlled trials are justified. And there was a remarkable amount of convergence between the two, not just in our eyes, but in their eyes, and said that the actual science and the scientific consensus had really moved forward, and they outlined certain standards that they felt not only could they agree on, but that scientists generally could agree on, although they admitted that there are a few people who still might, have a raging debate, but it had really, there had been an enormous amount of convergence over recent years. This we put into the context, as Steve said, that this particular debate, which has been, raging, is only one part of many issues of study design. And one of the things that we'll consider recommending, or at least finding, is that it's important for IRBs to look at the whole, validity of the study design. This convergence can give us all some, I think, have us all recognize that there has been real progress here on how to apply ethical standards to actual trials in a way that narrows the, well, let me put it, it increases the light and reduces the heat right here in this particular area. Before opening this up for other people's questions and comments, I'm just going to make a very general statement that we as a commission made in putting forward our report on Guatemala. And it frames what Steve has said on study design. There is no good ethics without good science, because you should not conduct any human trials that don't have the promise of good science, and there's no good science without good ethics. So it's a two-way street here. So getting study design ethically right in general is a very important, and in this particular case, I think we can point to some real progress that is to the credit of both researchers and people who are doing ethics coming together and looking in great detail about how to best serve populations. Now it's open up for any comments and questions. Raju.
I think a couple of comments. One is that, at the NIH for sure, I don't know about other federal agencies, that any research that involves foreign countries, it has to be justified as to why, you cannot do such research in this country and why you need to go outside this country. And And of course, any such research that is funded by the NIH and many other federal agencies are peer reviewed, and so that any such applications for support really requires rationale for doing that particular study and include study design and so on and so forth. So I think that there are a number of different layers of protection to ensure that the research is properly designed and that that there is a rational reason for going outside. For privately funded research, many of them are really related to getting a drug approved and that could be marketed in this country elsewhere, and those are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And again, Food and Drug Administration ensures that all of the study design has absolutely be very clear cut, and that there's a very good rationale for it, and that that it would lead to the kind of information that the agency would require for it to make a decision as to whether or not the drug is going to be or not going to be approved. So the question that I have for all of us to think about is that, so given the current set of rules and regulations and review procedures that we have, do we consider that they're not adequate? Or are we saying that there are additional things that we need to add in the types of recommendations that we have heard about that would strengthen them? So a clarification of that would be very helpful.
Steve, do you want to respond?
John, maybe you would.
Or-
It's a good question, Raju. I think that one of the purposes behind a commission of this sort is to try to bring consensus where that's possible on contentious issues. And if we look at the history of this particular issue, we see, as Amy was suggesting, really dramatic progress toward consensus. At the beginning, as you recall, with regard to the perinatal AZT studies, really the field was just split into two warring camps, one of which felt that placebo controls were acceptable, the other thought that they were genocidal, right? Blood on your hands, right? So I think that one thing we can do here is to try to nudge that emerging consensus along with the imprimatur of a presidential commission. So I think that that's an important function that we can perform here. We're not saying that the system is broken, but we are saying that, so long as the system adheres to the criteria that we set out, that it's a morally justifiable system. There is still some lingering debate, really, about whether the good clinical practices approach is ethically acceptable. There are doubts out there because it doesn't address the placebo issue, if I'm not mistaken, and we can fill that gap.
Yeah. Dan?
This may be a challenge, or maybe you've already done this, but I think it might help if we could have an example of a study that would fit these criteria and one that would be excluded by these criteria. Because I think they're right, but it would help us to be more reassured if we had some concrete examples.
I think, Dan, that's exactly right, and that is our intention.
And that actually should be easily doable because there are studies that have been done that don't fit this, and there are many, many studies that do fit it. And so I think that it would be good for us to, when we get to the report, to actually indicate that. And there, of course, there are studies which are in the gray area because people don't entirely agree about the facts of the study. But as far as those studies that clearly do and clearly don't, there are more examples of those that clearly do than that don't. And then there are a few in which there's a raging debate, not about these criteria, but about whether the facts of the study fit them, which is, of course, something that we as a commission cannot settle.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Amy, I mentioned the AZT perinatal trials. That was the huge debate. And interestingly, one of the crucial pressure points in that debate was really a kind of, well, and to call it a factual question is a bit misleading, but it was the question about methodology, right? And whether a placebo really was
Yes.
necessary,
Yes.
right? Because the opponents were saying, you can do an active control trial here and get the information you need.
Right.
And others were saying, no, you can't, you know?
And those we put in the gray area, right?
Yeah.
Because we're
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
not constituted to, and I don't know if anyone is actually constituted to settle that particular
Well, it's just,
one.
yeah, it's just a very complicated scientific question, yeah.
But what Dan is asking is eminently doable, and
Yes.
I think it would be a good idea to include that in
And
the
would ring
report.
out those principles.
Yeah, it would highlight how, the importance of the principles' relevance.
a good idea.
I saw Christine.
I have two questions.
And again, if anybody out there has any comment or question, just put them on a card and I know they'll be sent up here. Yes.
So the first one has to do with, I understand that the working group already moved away from just placebo to a larger question of randomized controlled trials. But as I'm looking at this, I'm wondering whether we even need comparator in there. Couldn't it be just choice of design in each of these criteria?
We've been searching for the word.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, because I think many of them, I can imagine, and I love Dan's example of
That's the
Dan's suggestion of examples, but there may be examples in which there's no comparator group, but these still
Yeah.
apply. So that's
So we
one
could say it
question.
applies more broadly, but
Yeah.
in fact, the comparator group was what stirred
Got us
this
in it.
huge debate.
Sure.
And I think it's incumbent on us to try to indicate where there's actually been progress in reconciling good science and good ethics.
I wonder if we could do both, though.
We can do
Recognize
both,
where it came from
absolutely.
and go further.
No reason why we can't do both.
Yeah. The second question is a very specific one, and Steve, I think you mentioned this. The criteria number 3 that says harms or inconvenience. And so I'm wondering how you're thinking about inconvenience, because that's a pretty undefined term in this context, and insignificant inconvenience might be a pretty high bar. I just don't know. I don't know what you were thinking about when you put inconvenience in there.
Well, John, I see you're moving your microphone.
Oh, just to be closer to the.
Got it.
Yeah.
So we wanted to
It's called Who's
include,
Gonna Blink First?
No, I've got a
So what
comment,
we-
but if you want to go ahead, Steve.
what we wanted to do was define the terms of
Sorry.
minimally risky or dislocating studies, where a person would be asked to do something that might not be comfortable or might take time that could be used doing something else.
Yeah.
If somebody comes in and is asked to participate in a study that might be a very simple study during the course of a medical visit, that sort of minimally disruptive study was what was on my mind. John?
Yeah, Christine is really raising, I think, a generic question that can be asked of just about any attempt at standard making. So here, the focus is on words like harm and inconvenience, and these are meaningful words, and they should act as some sort of a check. But there's always going to be a big question about inconvenience or harm according to who, right? And what degree of, say, harm or inconvenience crosses the threshold. I think it's just unavoidable that someone at some lower level is going to have to provide definitive meaning to those abstract terms as they apply them in practice.
Could I follow up?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I just wonder if we really want to say inconvenience.
Yeah.
I mean,
I-
I think harm, protection from harm makes
I
sense.
think-
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Inconvenience
Yeah.
is something that
Yes.
is different for each
Yeah.
person, and they agree or not agree, depending
Yeah.
on how inconvenient it is for them, So I just,
Yeah, okay, that
I'm
makes
just
sense,
wondering if
yeah,
we need it in
yeah.
there.
Yeah, the debate in Zeke Emanuel's paper that we're, leaning on here is over this drug to reduce vomiting, after chemotherapy. And there was a major debate between Bob Temple and Zeke on the issue of how severe does the vomiting have to be.
So here's what it means to say, what Christine is raising is is really about the word. The idea was that it doesn't have to be a physical harm. It could be having your life really thrown upside down because you're, nauseous all the time. It's not going to harm you in any way ultimately. But the word inconvenient doesn't convey that. And so we'll need just to broaden the notion of harm.
Discomfort, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, discomfort.
It was probably Alex's word.
But I think John is absolutely right. It's not going to be the case that we can use a word that is immune from the need for interpretation, but that wasn't Christine's point. It was really that inconvenience seems
not the word.
Trivial.
Too broad, or
It
too
seems,
broad.
yeah.
Well,
I think it sounds trivial. I mean, just yeah.
Can I give you two examples of what you were talking about?
Good.
Specific examples. I think, in cancer, for example, one of the drugs that is used is anti-angiogenesis compounds.
Yeah.
And they're very effective. And yet, one of the effects of that is hypertension.
Yeah.
So that is a mechanism-based adverse reaction, and so that you cannot get a benefit from the drug without having some degree of hypertension.
Right.
Similarly, in the case of lung cancer, there is a drug that is used called epidermal growth factor receptor inhibitors.
Yeah.
You treat them, people get rash. Rash is an indicator that the drug is working.
Yeah.
Right? So we cannot just say that there are certain, you cannot have any kinds of adverse reactions associated with this, and that would be bad. So there are all these called the mechanism-based adverse reactions as opposed to other types of things. So one has to be careful in defining what is it that we consider to be acceptable and what we don't consider to be acceptable.
And no one is saying that it's unacceptable to have trials that have side effects. That's not what.
They just need to be compensated for by the benefits of the drug.
It's the proportionate benefit argument. You're not going to say that any side effects are justified, right? We'll put you on the spot, Raju. I mean, you're not trying to say that we can't have standards that require that trials have...
No, all I'm saying is that we cannot speak in absolutes. All of them have to be nuanced, and that's all
Agreed.
I'm saying.
Yeah, we agree.
Yeah. Good. Other questions and issues on
Anything from the audience?
on study design?
Nothing from the audience?
We can actually break early if, because we are going to go on late. So nobody is going to be deprived of a full day of work here. We will reconvene at 3:45, and we will go on till 6 o'clock because we have Ken Feinberg, who's coming at 5 o'clock, and he turned his schedule upside down to get here. So we will reconvene here at 5 o'clock, at 3:45, where we're going to have a broad discussion of equivalent protections, community engagement, and site selection. And then our final session of the day will be, we'll have a discussion with Ken Feinberg on compensation for research-related injuries. Okay, thank you all very much.
Nelson, Michael, and Christine,